let's talk about the start of life on this planet. First, what you need to know is there are 3 domains of life. Some of you are familiar with kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Domain is above kingdom. There are 3 of them. Archaea and bacteria are our prokaryotes, and then we have our eukaryotes. We've divided out recently archaea from bacteria because archaea tend to live in these very extreme environments, so many of you know them as extremophiles. Our bacteria are everywhere. We know that there are a number of genes that only are specific to archaea, and we'll talk about those more later. Eukaryotes are everything that you're probably most familiar with from plants and animals and fungus and so on. The Earth formed, as we mentioned, about 4.6 billion years ago, and the idea is with this early environment it was a very hot place, so things would have behaved differently. But we said after about the first billion years, prokaryotes may have actually started to form through abiotic synthesis of monomers and eventually polymers and the protocells that we mentioned before. But where would this have happened? Well, you have to keep in mind that with early atmosphere, everything was very, very, very hot, and then it started to cool. As it cooled, the water vapor turned to liquid, right? But if you remember from our last talk, UV is still very, very high, and remember it's extremely deadly in high doses. So what we have to look for is a place that's safe. And we think that safe place was probably at the bottom of the oceans, likely associated with volcanic vents that would have provided sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, and others to help the organisms actually start to form. This abiotic synthesis we've mentioned, and the idea of taking amino acids and nucleic acids and actually forming proteins, RNA, and other polymers, putting those together into this protocell type. And remember, this is not a cell with organelles or anything complex. This is very basic, essentially an oil membrane with RNA and proteins inside. But we have to get to the point of self-replication if we're actually going to evolve. So we think this is actually RNA based. So knowing exactly who the first organism was on the planet is fairly impossible for us. We can make some estimates of what it would have been, how it would have behaved, but an organism by your standards, it certainly was not, okay? So when we look at these differences between our early ancestors or this universal ancestor, we don't really have a good feel about it, more than we know what organisms could have survived in that type of environment and eventually would have given rise to the kingdom and domains that you're more familiar with the eukaryotes. On our tree, we will focus primarily on the domain for the eukaryotes, but we will also look at bacteria and archaea. So archaea, remember, were the extremophiles. The bacteria, everything around us today is coated in bacteria. What we don't have a good handle on is the universal ancestor. We know it was single-celled. We know that it was very basic in structure, but we don't know a lot beyond that. We know that this is the basic timeline, and if you're interested, you can kind of plan it out in your head how this would have occurred. Prokaryotes first, then we get some eukaryotic fossils that are about 2 billion years old, so that's not bad on a 4.6 billion year old planet. But our common ancestor that we'll focus on is for the multicellular eukaryotes. That's about 1.5 billion years old. And then looking at multicellular eukaryotes for actually trying to find a fossil is about 1 billion years, and it's found in rocks primarily, of course, many of them in Greenland area that we see these. And then we'll look for multicellular plants and fungus and so on once they get onto land, only about 500 million years ago when they started to colonize land. Now, as far as you go, humans diverged from other primates about 6 or 7 million years ago, but our current form of Homo sapiens only originated about 200,000 years ago. Just so you know kind of where things are in the grand scheme of things as far as your age compared to the planet. And if we compress down Earth's history, you appeared only about 0.2 seconds ago in an hour time frame. So just to give you a relative sense of how new humans are in this whole landscape.